Hello everyone, welcome to another very exciting tutorial. Today we're going to be building an autocomplete box, like an autocomplete input as you might heard. So let's get started. Going to the Codeness Online editor. What am I going to do initially? I'm going to do create a container, and then within a container I'm just going to put an input box, just like that. So now you can see that we have a container and then there is an input type. I'm going to go to kotus.com and then going to the Kotus UI library. I'm just gonna, as always, copy the library's CSS file just because it gives me some classes that I can use. Uh, so let's have it right away. It actually added some sort of a style to my input. Now let's get a little bit of a styling on the container. I'm gonna give the container width maybe 60% of its parent width, and then I will try to center it. Let's say margin 20 pixel from up and down, and then auto to the right and left. So now it's kind of centered. Maybe give it 100 so it comes down here, and we have our input here. So now what I would like to do is maybe give it a background of, let's give it 333 to make it dark. I'm going to style my input, uh, making the background transparent, and then there was a border, so I'm just gonna disable the border. And then in my parent container, I will give it a border radius of 3%. So now we have some sort of a border, maybe even higher. Let's make it like 6. All right. And I will make the font size in my input a little bit bigger. So now it's a bit bigger. Now, as you can see, when I type it, I will change the color to be white. So now it's white. And also what I would like to do is maybe give it a placeholder to the input in my HTML and then just say search here, right? So now we have this search here. When you click on it and type, you can search for your content, right? Now, since it's going to be an autocomplete box, I need to add another uh, sort of panel that will ultimately, when you type, shows the suggestions down here. So let's make that happen. I'm going to create a div called suggestions and maybe just put two dummy data. I'm just going to put sort of maybe three divs with some suggestions. Let's say this is an autocomplete for, you know, choosing countries. It can be anything, right? So I'm just going to put, for example, I don't know, like USA, and then I will put India, and I will put maybe Argentina, and yeah, that's about it. It's okay. The reason for this is because I first want to style and give a look and feel to the actual autocomplete uh, box. So now I know that the inputs are in my suggestions. So I will put suggestions here. Maybe give it a border top of 2 pixel solid and then maybe 999. So I have some sort of like a indication. And then inside the suggestions, I have the actual suggested results, which are inside div. And I'm gonna denote with like, I'm just gonna style the divs that are right inside. So you can see this is right inside the parent suggestions. So I'm gonna give it a padding of 15 pixel, maybe font size of let's say 10, not 10 pixel, but maybe 20 pixel. And then color, obviously we need to change it to something brighter. Looks good. And also I want the divs to have a border top of 1 pixel solid, and then maybe let's put 666. So now this is going to be the suggestions that will come up when we search, right? So now one would say I would like to have some sort of a hover effect on it. So I'm copying this and then say hover, maybe give a background color of, let's say maybe 999. So now you can see that we have this kind of thing. Maybe actually let's do this. I'm going to Kotu's UI library in the colors section. There are good colors over here. So I'm going to choose this blue one. Let's choose this one, for example. So I'm going back and change this to this color. Now it looks kind of nicer. You can see that down here when I hover, it kind of disregards the border radius of the parent container. To fix it, you have to go to the container and say overflow hidden, right? So now it will have its own corner down here without disregarding it. All right, looks quite good. Maybe one more thing we can do on the suggested divs is to put cursor pointer, since we're gonna finally be able to click on them, and then it will do the page will do something, or an operation will happen based on the name, right? So all right, it looks good so far. Now let's jump to the actual interaction. So I'm going to change this to this view so that it's kind of nicer. And then going to the JavaScript, I'm just going to create some data, right? This data can be in the front end, it can come from a backend API, like the list of countries, right? But for now, I'm just going to put it sort of hard coded in my JavaScript, right? So I'm just going to put countries, and then obviously an array of my countries. I can right away put United States, India, Argentina, but I will create objects for each of them and put a name, USA. Maybe at some point I want to add another parameter to them. I don't know, like an operation, like a link to somewhere. So this is the first one, and then I'm gonna create another one, name India, and then finally I'm just gonna create another object and name with the name Argentina, right? So I have my data over here. Now, what I would like to do is just to make sure I will catch the sort of when I type here, I know what I'm typing in the JavaScript section, right? So now I know that I'm just going to give it a class name, like, I don't know, search input. And then in my JavaScript, I'm just going to reference it. So search input document.query selector, and then with the class search input, now I have a reference to it. And now there are many ways you can catch the sort of the event of when you're typing, right? So for example, I can say search input dot add event listener, because that's the event listener that because I want to add some sort of like an event listener to it when I'm typing. So let's put, for example, key down, right? And then I will pass a function to it, function, and inside the function, I will say just console log search input dot value, right? So in this way, whenever the keydown happens on this search input, I will log what's the value that is getting typed. So now if I open the inspector in Chrome and go to console, let's type and see if it works. So for example, USA, nothing happens. I'm just because it's on errors. Let's put default. So as you can see, when I type inside it, so USA, you can see that it doesn't actually get the, let me do it again. Let me clean it up. Let's just type USA. It's funny how when you type USA, it actually presses US because this one is on key down, right? If I change it to key press now, let's see what happens. I'm just going to clean it. Let's say USA. Again, it didn't type the last one. And then there is another event which is corresponding to an input box, and that is key up, right? So now if I start typing USA, you can see that we have the full list. So it's very important. Sometimes you're gonna read a document and you want to do it. There are three events that work with the input, for example. One is key press, key down, and key up. You want to make sure you use the key up so that you capture everything you type. So for example, now if I type Argentina, you'll see that it gives me one by one the data that I need, right? So that's good. Now I have my data. So I'm going to close this. Now what I want to do is every time I click, I type something, I want to check that whether this corresponds to this or not, and then I will just show it in this results set, right? Just for the fun of it, I'm just going to put another country with the same name. Let's say, for example, name, I don't know, like Armenia, so that we have two that starts with A. So now I have my data here. So I'm just going to create a variable called, input, and then I want to say search input dot value, so that whenever I type, it goes down here, right? So now what I want to do is that I want to search in this countries list to see if I get my data. In order to do that, I'm going to say countries, because the operation that we're going to do in JavaScript is called filtering, right? We're going to filter this array to see if it corresponds to anything that we type. So countries.filter, and then I would pass a function, and then inside the function I will say data, right? Or I don't know, like input. And then inside this, what I want to do is see if I can say return uh, input. Maybe this should be country because I'm going through the countries list. So return country, country, which is each of these. So it's gonna just loop over all of these. Country.name starts with our input, right? So basically the filter operation in JavaScript, what it does is that it goes over the array that the filter applies, and then you pass a function, and then you pass, it just gets a sort of as an input, it gets a function that has the countries, and then what you need to do is to make sure that the country dot name, which we know that it has name, starts with that input, right? And then I will just put it in, like, say, another variable or a constant called suggestions, right? Now if I just console log my suggestions, I'm just going to say suggestions and then the data that I get. Let's see what happens in my input, right? So if I say, I don't know, like let's say for example, Canada, you can see that nothing happens. The array is empty. But if I type USA, you can see still the array is nothing. Let's see what would be the reason. So the country dot name starts with input. So this should potentially work. I'm just gonna just console log the country here just to make sure that when I type it actually, yes. So USA, India, Argentina, and Armenia. So this should actually work because I say with this case, returns country.name starts with input, and the input is the value I get. So let's see why it doesn't work. So if I say country.name and then also input at the same time, now if I say you can see that it says USA, India, Argentina. One of the important things in JavaScript is that it's case sensitive. So that might be the reason, right? Because all of these are not case sensitive. So we first convert these to case insensitive. So for example, the way you do it in JavaScript is country.name dot to lowercase, and then we will check if it starts with the value that we type or not. So now if I just say U, you can see that the array is not empty now, and it actually returns our United States. Now if I type A, you can see that there are two values, Argentina and Armenia, which works pretty well, right? So now we have our suggestions list based on what we type. Now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go ahead and remove this data from here. So now we don't see anything. And then in the JavaScript, I'm going to say create my suggestions, right? So basically, when I get my suggestions, which is a list, I'm going to go and say suggestions dot for each, because the filter operations response is also an array. So for each suggestion that I get from this countries list, I'm going to create a for each function suggested, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a div, const div equals to document.query selector div. And then I'm just going to say div.inner HTML is the suggested dot name, right? Because these are objects with name key. And then I know that I have my container, which is the suggestion. So I have to create a reference here to it. So I'm just going to copy this, paste this, and then I'm just going to say suggestions panel. And then here, this is going to be suggestions. And then here, I will do suggestions panel dot append child. And then I would do the div, right? So now I suppose if I type Armenia, it should actually filter the list, the ones that start with whatever I type. In this case, A, it should show the suggestions. Let's see if it works. So if I say A, something went wrong. Let's see what does the error we got. Okay, inner HTML of null, it can't set it. That's correct. So we have the, instead of, this is the issue. Document query selector, no. Document create element, because I'm going to create these elements. So now if I type A, you'll see that it actually suggests me Argentina and Armenia. And if I go ahead, they both have R. You can see that it actually appends the suggested. As you can see, what we need to do every time we enter something, we want to make sure that the suggestions panel gets empty. So here, when I do input, when I get the value, I get suggestions panel dot inner HTML nothing, right? So now if I say A, it works. R, same thing, because both of them start with R. Now the moment I type G, you'll see that it filters and shows the Argentina. Now going back, it will show all of them. And then M will show Armenia. And then going back, I say USA, it will show USA, and then India, it will show India. But there is a problem to it, right? So initially when you start typing, there's nothing. There's no suggestion panel, right? So USA, it finds it. But now suddenly you can see that when there's nothing in the input, it actually shows all of them. Maybe that's a feature that you want to have. It's kind of okay, but say this list is so big, so you don't want to maybe have it, but for a short list, maybe it's kind of cool so that they can actually see all the options they have. But for me, I want to make sure that the state that I start with no suggestions, when this is empty, still is going to be empty. So I need to make sure in my JavaScript, whenever I type, I also do a check if the input is equals to empty. I want to make sure that I also clean up the suggestions panel, right? So now if I say Armenia and then going back, you'll see that still the list is not empty. Let's see why. Even though my input is empty, the suggestions panel inner HTML doesn't really work. Maybe the reason being that I have to make it here and paste it at the end, right? Let's see if it works. USA. empty, yes. Because what happened was that when you put the input, it first sort of um, clears the panel, and then it will go ahead and tries to find the countries that starts with like an empty, and that would result in all of these, right? So you want to make sure you want to put this check at the end of your operation, so that at the end, if the input, which is the thing that is over here, is empty, the suggestions panel gets empty by using the inner HTML equals to nothing, right? So Armenia, you can see that now Armenia comes in, and then if I do Argentina, Argentina, A, R, both of them, India, India, USA, USA, right? So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. This was the most simple case of an autocomplete operation. I just wanted to show you how you can utilize a little bit of a CSS and also a little bit of a JavaScript, where especially the filtering and the for each, kind of get to know what it does if you don't already know. And yes, maybe in the next tutorials, we're going to get this data from the actual backend. So it's going to be an end-to-end application, meaning that it has both backend and frontend. So yeah, so if you enjoyed this tutorial, please go ahead and like it. Please go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you haven't. And I wish you a great day and night. See you next time.